An Apache widower carried his dying infant through 7 frontier towns, begging strangers for a single drop of milk to save her life. But when every door slammed in his face and his daughter's breathing grew shallow, a destitute maid with nothing but borrowed clothes and calloused hands appeared at his campfire and whispered, "I have what she needs." The Arizona Territory, late autumn, 1882. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. A vast expanse of sand and scrub brush, painted in shades of copper and burnt orange beneath a merciless sun. Heat shimmered off the rocks like spirits dancing, and the wind carried the scent of creosote and dust. In the shadow of a red canyon wall, where ancient petroglyphs told stories of ancestors long gone, Halion knelt beside a dying fire, cradling his infant daughter against his chest. The flames had diminished to glowing embers, pulsing like a heartbeat in the gathering darkness. Around him, the desert breathed its evening song, cicadas chirping in the mesquite, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, the whisper of sand sliding down the canyon walls. Nuna was 3 months old. Her skin, once warm and bronze like her father's, had turned pale, almost grey. Her lips were cracked and dry, tiny fissures that would have bled if she had any moisture left in her body. Her tiny chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths that sounded like the flutter of a wounded bird. She had not cried in 2 days. The silence was worse than any scream. Now she only whimpered, soft mewling sounds that broke something deep inside Halion every time he heard them. Her eyes, when they opened at all, stared at nothing, unfocused and glassy, as if she were already looking into the next world. He had tried everything. He had traveled from his people's hidden camp in the Chiricahua Mountains, a place the soldiers had not yet found, down into the valleys where the white settlers had built their towns with their wooden buildings and false promises. The journey had taken him through arroyos and across mesas, past abandoned Apache camps where the bones of his people's homes still stood like skeletons against the sky. He carried Nuna in a cradleboard, strapped to his back at first, the traditional way, but when she grew too weak to hold her head up, he had taken her out and carried her in his arms instead, wrapped in blankets pressed against his heart. He had walked into Fort Benson with Nuna bundled tight, his eyes lowered in the submissive posture the white men expected, his voice humble and quiet. The fort was a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by wooden walls, American flags snapping in the wind above watchtowers where soldiers stood with rifles. Halion had approached slowly, hands visible, showing he carried no weapons. "Please," he had said to the soldiers at the gate, 2 young men with sunburned faces and suspicious eyes. "My daughter needs milk. My wife died bringing her into this world. I've no way to feed her. Is there anyone here who can help? Anyone nursing? I can work. I can pay." The soldiers had laughed. It was not the laughter of joy, but of cruelty, the kind that came from men who had been taught that some lives mattered less than others. One of them, a red-faced sergeant with tobacco-stained teeth and a belly that hung over his belt, had spat a brown, an Apache widower carried his dying infant through 7 frontier towns, begging strangers for a single drop of milk to save her life. But when every door slammed in his face and his daughter's breathing grew shallow, a destitute maid with nothing but borrowed clothes and calloused hands appeared at his campfire and whispered, "I have what she needs." Stream of juice into the dirt near Halion's feet. "We don't help savages," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "Go back to your reservation, Apache. We got nothing for you here. You're lucky we don't shoot you for coming this close." The other soldier, younger, had at least looked uncomfortable. He had glanced at the bundle in Halion's arms, seen the tiny face peeking out, and for a moment something had flickered in his eyes. Pity, maybe, or recognition of shared humanity, but he said nothing. He turned away and let his sergeant speak for both of them. Halion had swallowed his pride and walked away. His jaw had been clenched so tight his teeth ached, his fists balled at his sides, but he had walked. Pride meant nothing when your child was starving. Anger meant nothing when time was running out. He had mounted his horse, a spotted mare that had been with him since he was a young man, and ridden to the next town. Red Mesa was a dusty collection of buildings that seemed to have been dropped randomly into the desert. A mercantile, a saloon, a blacksmith, a few houses with tidy gardens behind white picket fences. The streets were unpaved, just hard-packed dirt that turned to choking dust when the wind blew. Alian had tied his horse to a post outside the mercantile and approached a woman carrying a basket of vegetables. She wore a clean calico dress, pressed and proper, her hair pinned neatly under a bonnet, her hands covered in lace gloves despite the heat. She looked like someone who had never known hunger, never known desperation. "Ma'am," he had said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "Do you know anyone nursing? Anyone with milk to spare? My baby is dying. I need help." The woman had looked at him as if he were a coyote that had wandered into town, dangerous and unpredictable. Her face had gone pale, then flushed with something that looked like anger or fear or both. She clutched her basket tighter against her body and backed away, her eyes darting toward the buildings as if looking for help. "Get away from me," she hissed, her voice rising. "Don't you come near me or my children. Don't you dare." Other people had stopped to watch. A man in a shopkeeper's apron had stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting on something behind his back, probably a gun. A group of miners standing outside the saloon had turned to stare, their conversation dying. Alian had felt their eyes on him like physical weight, pressing down, suffocating. He had looked at each of them in turn, silently pleading, but no one stepped forward. No one offered help. He had left before they could force him out. Town after town, the response was the same. In Silver Springs, a shopkeeper had chased him off the porch with a broom, swinging it like a weapon, shouting about savages and thieves. Alian had stumbled backward, clutching Nuna to his chest, shielding her from the blows. In Mesquite Flats, he had found a ranch on the outskirts, a sprawling property with cattle grazing in the distance. He had knocked on the door of the main house, a large structure with a wraparound porch. A ranch wife had answered, a heavy-set woman with flour on her apron and irritation in her eyes. When he explained his situation, she had looked at him with disgust. "I would rather pour my milk into the dirt than give it to an Indian baby," she had said. Then she had slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. In Copper Ridge, he had been threatened with a rope. 3 men had cornered him near the livery stable, one of them holding a coil of rope, another a rifle. "We don't want your kind here," one had said. "You've got until sundown to get out. After that, we hang you from the nearest tree and leave you for the buzzards. 7 towns. 7 rejections. And with each one, Nuna grew weaker. Her whimpers became softer, her movements more lethargic. She stopped opening her eyes. Her skin took on a waxy quality, stretched thin over her small bones. Alian could count her ribs. He could see the pulse fluttering in her neck, fast and frantic, like a hummingbird's wings. Now, 3 days after leaving the last settlement, Alian sat alone in the desert, watching his daughter fade. He had tried feeding her water mixed with cornmeal, a paste he had made by grinding dried corn between 2 stones and mixing it with water from his canteen. But she could not keep it down. It dribbled from the corners of her mouth, and when he tried to push it past her lips with his finger, she turned her head away. He had chewed jerky until it was soft and pulpy, then tried to get her to swallow tiny pieces, but her mouth would not open. Her jaw was slack, her tongue unresponsive. She was too weak even to suckle. Her eyes, when they opened, were glassy and unfocused, staring at nothing, seeing everything and nothing at once. Alian pressed his forehead against hers and whispered prayers in his native tongue. The language his mother had taught him, the language his wife had spoken as she died. The words came haltingly, broken by grief. He prayed to the mountain spirits that watched over his people. He prayed to Usun, the giver of life. He prayed to the sun that warmed the earth and the wind that carried the rain. He promised everything he had. His horse, his rifle, his life. "Take me instead," he whispered. "Let her live. Just give me a way to save her, please." But the sky remained silent. The desert gave no answer. The sun was setting now, bleeding red and gold across the horizon, like a wound opening in the sky. Shadows lengthened across the desert floor, stretching long and thin. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, a mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls, and another answered. The desert was waking up for the night. Halian built up the fire, though the night was still warm. He needed the light. He needed to see her face. He needed to know the exact moment when she stopped breathing, so he could hold her through it, so she would not die alone in the dark. He had wrapped her in the last clean blanket he owned, the one his wife had woven with red and black patterns during the long winter before Nuna was born. Ayana had worked on it every evening, her hands moving steadily, creating geometric designs that told stories of their people. The edges were frayed now, stained with dust and sweat, but it still smelled faintly of sage, the herb his wife used to burn to bless their home. Halian pulled the blanket tighter around his daughter and rocked her slowly, humming a song his mother used to sing when he was a child. The melody was simple, meant to soothe. His voice cracked on the high notes. He had not cried since the day he buried his wife, but now tears slipped down his face and disappeared into the collar of his shirt. He thought about the moment Nuna was born. How his wife, Ayana, had labored for nearly a full day in their small dwelling, a structure made of branches and hides that they had built together. Her face had been slick with sweat, her hands gripping his so tightly he thought his bones might break. The pain had rolled through her in waves, each one stronger than the last. The midwife had come from the neighboring camp, an old woman with knowing eyes and gnarled hands who had delivered half the children in their band. She had worked quickly, efficiently, murmuring prayers and instructions. And when Nuna finally came into the world slick and squalling, her cries strong and healthy, Halian had felt a joy so pure it had brought him to his knees. But then Ayana had begun to bleed. Too much blood, too fast. It had soaked through the blankets beneath her, pooled on the ground. The midwife had tried everything, packing cloth, pressing herbs that were supposed to stop bleeding, chanting prayers. But nothing worked. Ayana had looked up at Halian with eyes that already knew what was happening. She had reached for Nuna with trembling hands, and he had placed the baby in her arms. Ayana had kissed their daughter's forehead once, twice, 3 times. And then she had looked at Halian one last time and said, "Promise me you will keep her alive, no matter what it costs. Promise me." He had promised. He had sworn it on his life, on everything he held sacred. And now he was failing. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Halian adjusted Nuna in his arms and stared into the flames. He wondered if Ayana could see him now, if her spirit watched from the place beyond the stars. He wondered if she was angry with him for not doing enough, for not being stronger, for not finding a way. He wondered if she would forgive him. A sound broke through his thoughts. Footsteps, slow, uneven, the scrape of boots against sand and stone. Halian's head snapped up, his body tensing. His hand moved to the knife at his belt. Out here, alone, visible from miles away because of the fire, you could not be too careful. Bandits roamed the territory, men who had deserted from armies or fled from justice. And there were bounty hunters who collected Apache scalps for money, but the figure that emerged from the twilight was not a bandit. It was a woman. She was small, her frame thin beneath a dress that had seen far better days. The fabric was faded, patched at the elbows and hem, and her shawl was threadbare, barely enough to keep out the night chill. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a braid that hung over one shoulder, and her face was shadowed by the brim of a worn straw hat. She carried a bundle in her arms and walked with the slow, cautious gait of someone who had traveled far on foot. She stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at him. Her eyes were large and brown, ringed with exhaustion, but they held no fear, only a kind of quiet determination. "I saw your fire from the ridge," she said. Her voice was soft, accented with the lilt of Spanish. "I have been walking since morning. May I share your warmth? Just for tonight. I will not be any trouble." Halian did not answer immediately. He studied her, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. She did not look dangerous. She looked exhausted, hungry, like someone who had been running from something. Her dress hung loose on her frame. Her hands were red and chapped, the hands of someone who worked hard. He glanced down at Nuna, then back at the woman. Something in her eyes, a sadness that matched his own, made him nod slowly. "Sit," he said. His English was good, learned from traders and missionaries. "There is space by the fire." "You are welcome." The woman moved closer, each step deliberate. She lowered herself to the ground with a sigh of relief. She set her bundle beside her and held her hands out to the flames, rubbing them together. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried genuine gratitude. "I did not think I would find anyone out here. I thought I might freeze before morning." Halion said nothing. He watched her from the corner of his eye, still wary, still protective of Nuna. The woman turned slightly, her attention drawn to the bundle in his arms. She looked at the baby and her expression softened immediately. "Your daughter?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, unable to speak. "She is beautiful," the woman said, and there was no false politeness in her tone. Then her smile faded as she looked more closely. "But she is sick." Halion's jaw tightened. The words came out rough. "She is starving," he said. "Her mother died giving birth to her. I have no milk. I have tried everything. Goat milk, cornmeal, even sugar water. Nothing works, and no one will help us. I've been to 7 towns. Every door was slammed in my face." The woman was silent for a long moment. She looked into the fire, her face unreadable. Then she turned back to him, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "My name is Lucia Reyes," she said. "I'm a maid. I work in the big houses, cleaning floors, washing clothes, cooking meals. I have nothing. No family left alive, no money saved, no home to call my own. But I have one thing." She reached up and placed a hand over her heart. "I lost my baby 2 months ago," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "A fever took her. It came on fast, burned through her in 3 days. She was 6 months old. Her name was Rosalia. She had dark hair like mine. And when she died, I held her until she went cold." Helion's breath caught. He stared at her, understanding beginning to dawn. Lucia's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "I still have milk," she said. "It has not stopped. Every morning I wake up and it is there, aching, a reminder of what I lost. The doctors told me it would dry up, but it has not. And tonight when I saw your fire, when I saw you holding that baby, I knew why. I finally understood." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Let me feed her," she said, "please. Let me give her what my daughter no longer needs. Let me do something good with this pain." Halion could not speak. His throat had closed completely. Something was breaking inside him, some wall he had built to contain his grief, and behind it was hope, fragile and terrifying. He looked down at Nuna. Her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow. She was so close to slipping away. He looked back at Lucia. This stranger, this woman who had nothing, who had lost everything, who stood at the edge of his fire and offered the only thing she had left. Her hands were trembling. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were clear, determined. Slowly, carefully, Halion extended his arms, offering his daughter to her. "Please," he whispered. "Please save her." Lucia took Nuna gently, cradling her as if she were made of glass. She adjusted the baby in her lap, supporting her head, and pulled her shawl around them both. Then she bent her head. Halion turned away, staring into the fire, giving them space. Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of fabric. And then, after a moment, a tiny sound, a whimper, a small intake of breath. And then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a baby suckling. Halion closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his knees and breathed deeply, trying to steady himself. Across the fire, Lucia hummed softly, a lullaby in Spanish, her voice gentle and low. Nuna did not cry. She drank, and for the first time in days, the terrible silence was broken by the sound of life continuing. When Lucia finally spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "She is so hungry," she whispered. "Poor little one. She is drinking like she has been waiting for this." Halion turned back. Lucia was looking down at Nuna with an expression he recognized. It was the same look Ayana had worn. Love, fierce, protective, immediate. "Thank you," Halion said, and his voice broke. "Thank you. You have given me back my daughter." Lucia looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said. "Thank you. You have given me something I thought I would never have again." "What is that?" Halion asked. Lucia smiled through her tears and looked back down at the baby. "A reason to keep going." The fire crackled between them, warm and steady. Above, the stars began to appear one by one, filling the sky with light. The moon rose slowly over the canyon rim, painting everything in silver. And in the middle of the vast, lonely desert, two broken people sat together in the firelight, bound by grief and hope, and watched over a child who had just been pulled back from the edge of death by the kindness of a stranger who had become something more. The desert night deepened around them, and the temperature dropped steadily as the hours passed. Halion fed more wood to the fire, careful to keep the flames high enough to provide warmth, but not so bright that they would attract unwanted attention from anyone who might be traveling through the territory. The firelight cast dancing shadows across the canyon walls, making the ancient petroglyphs seem to move and breathe. Lucia continued to nurse Nuna, rocking her gently, humming that Spanish lullaby in a voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the crackle of burning mesquite. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, Nuna finally pulled away from Lucia's breast, her tiny mouth going slack, her body relaxing completely. The baby's eyes were closed, her breathing deep and even for the first time in days. Her face had lost some of that terrible greyish pallor, replaced by the faintest hint of colour returning to her cheeks. Lucia adjusted her dress carefully, maintaining her modesty, and wrapped Nuna more securely in the blanket before looking up at Halion. "She drank well," Lucia said quietly. "More than I expected. Her body was desperate for nourishment. She will need to feed again in a few hours, probably before dawn. Babies this young eat frequently, especially when they're trying to recover from starvation." Halion nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from his daughter's peaceful face. "I cannot thank you enough," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was going to lose her tonight. I had accepted it. I was just waiting for her to stop breathing." Lucia's expression softened with understanding. "I know that feeling," she said. "I watched my Rosalia slip away, and there was nothing I could do. The fever consumed her so quickly. One day she was smiling and reaching for my face, and 3 days later she was gone. I would have given anything to save her, anything at all." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by the invisible threads of grief and loss. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the night sky. Finally, Halion spoke again. "Where were you going when you found my fire? Where were you headed?" Lucia looked away, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Nowhere," she said simply. "Everywhere. I was walking because I could not stay in the last town anymore. The family I worked for, they dismissed me after Rosalia died. They said I was too distracted, too sad. They said I made them uncomfortable with my grief. So I took what little money they owed me and started walking. I thought maybe I would find work in another town, or maybe I would just keep walking until I could not walk anymore." Halion heard the emptiness in her voice, the bone-deep exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from a soul that had been hollowed out by loss. He recognized it because he carried the same weight. "You saved my daughter's life tonight," he said. "That is not nothing. That is everything." Lucia smiled sadly and looked down at Nuna, still sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Maybe we saved each other," she whispered. "I was beginning to think there was no reason for me to keep going, that my life had no purpose anymore. But this little one needed me, and I needed to be needed." Halion stood slowly and moved around the fire to sit beside Lucia. He reached out carefully, and she transferred Nuna back into his arms. The baby stirred slightly but did not wake, her small body warm and relaxed against his chest. He could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. "You can stay with us," Halion said suddenly. The words came out before he had fully thought them through, but once they were spoken, he knew they were right. "Travel with us back to my camp. We have food, shelter. It is not much, but it is safe, and Nuna will need you. She cannot survive on anything else right now. She needs what you can give her." Lucia turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the firelight. "You would trust me?" she asked. "You do not even know me. I could be anyone. I could bring trouble to your people." Halion shook his head. "You walked out of the darkness and offered to save my daughter when no one else would help. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. My people will understand. They will see what you have done, and they will welcome you." Lucia was quiet for a long time, considering his offer. Her hands twisted together in her lap, nervous energy finding an outlet. Finally, she nodded. "I will stay," she said, "at least until the baby is strong enough to try other foods. I cannot leave her now, not when she needs me. But I must warn you, I know nothing about living in the wilderness. I've always worked in towns, in houses. I do not know how to hunt or track or any of the skills your people have. You can learn," Halion said, "and you already have the most important skill. You can keep my daughter alive. Everything else can be taught." They settled into a comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Halion added another piece of wood, and the flames leapt higher, pushing back the darkness. In the distance, a coyote howled again, but this time it did not sound mournful. It sounded like the desert singing its ancient song, the song that had been here long before people arrived and would remain long after they were gone. As the night wore on, Lucia dozed fitfully, her head nodding forward before jerking back up. Halion could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Sleep," he said gently. "I will keep watch. You are safe here." Lucia looked at him with grateful eyes. "Wake me when the baby needs to feed again," she said. "I will know when it is time. My body will tell me." She lay down near the fire, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders, and within minutes her breathing had deepened into sleep. Halion sat with Nuna cradled against his chest, watching both of them. This strange woman, who had appeared out of nowhere, this gift from whatever spirits had finally decided to answer his prayers. He thought about what his wife would say if she could see them now. Ayana had always believed that people came into your life for a reason, that the spirits guided those who were meant to find each other. Perhaps she had sent Lucia to them. Perhaps this was her way of keeping her promise to protect their daughter. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of time in their ancient dance. Halion hummed softly to Nuna, the same songs his mother had sung to him, the songs that carried the stories of his people through generations. He told his daughter about her mother, about the beautiful woman who had given her life so that Nuna could live. He told her about the camp they would return to, about her grandmother who was waiting to meet her, about the other children she would play with. He made promises in the darkness, promises that he would keep her safe, that he would raise her to be strong and brave like her mother, that he would never let her forget where she came from. Just before dawn, Lucia stirred and sat up quickly, her hands moving to her chest. "The baby," she said. "She will be hungry soon. I can feel it." As if on cue, Nuna began to whimper, her small face scrunching up in preparation for a cry. Halion handed her to Lucia, and once again the woman settled the infant against her breast. The feeding went more smoothly this time, Nuna latching on immediately, her small hands kneading gently as she drank. Lucia's face relaxed into an expression of peace, and Halion realized that this act was healing her as much as it was saving. His daughter, when the sun finally rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, they prepared to travel. Halion had very few possessions to pack. Everything he owned could fit in 2 leather bags that he strapped to his horse. Lucia had even less, just the small bundle she had been carrying and the clothes on her back. They set out, as the morning. Air was still cool, heading north toward the mountains. The journey would take 3 days if they traveled carefully and avoided the main trails where soldiers and settlers might spot them. Halion led his horse on foot, allowing Lucia to ride with Nuna. The baby was wrapped securely against Lucia's chest in a makeshift sling Halion had fashioned from one of his blankets. The woman sat awkwardly in the saddle at first, clearly not accustomed to riding, but she held on gamely and did not complain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They traveled in silence for the first few hours, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The terrain was rough, all sand and rock and scrubby vegetation that clung stubbornly to life in the harsh environment. They followed ancient trails that only the Apache knew, paths that wound between boulders and through narrow canyons, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Twice they had to stop so Lucia could nurse Nuna, and each time Halion turned away to give them privacy, scouting ahead or checking their back trail for signs of pursuit. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and heavy. Halion found a spot in the shade of a large rock formation where they could rest. He shared his dried meat and the last of his corn cakes with Lucia, and they passed his water skin back and forth, each taking small sips to conserve their supply. There was a spring about half a day's travel ahead where they could refill, but until then, they had to be careful. "Tell me about your wife," Lucia said suddenly, breaking the long silence. "What was she like?" Halion was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Ayana was strong," he finally said. "Not just physically, though she could work as hard as any man, but strong in her spirit. She never complained, never gave up on anything she set her mind to. When we were first married, we had very little. The soldiers were pushing our people onto reservations, taking our land. Many of our band wanted to fight to resist. Ayana convinced them that survival was more important than pride. She helped us find a place deep in the mountains where the soldiers would not look. She organized the women to preserve food, to prepare for harsh winters. She saved many lives with her wisdom." Lucia listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. "She sounds remarkable," she said. "She was," Halion agreed. "And she wanted this baby so much. We had been married for 5 years before Nuna came. Ayana had lost 2 babies before, both in the early months when they were still growing inside her. When she finally carried Nuna to full term, she was so happy. She spent months preparing, making clothes and blankets, gathering herbs and medicine. She had so many plans for our daughter. And then, his voice trailed off, the words too painful to continue. Lucia reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. "You do not have to say more," she said softly. "I understand. Loss is loss, and there are no words that make it easier." They rested for another hour before continuing their journey. As they traveled, Lucia began to ask questions about Apache life, about the customs and traditions, about what would be expected of her when they reached the camp. Halion answered as best he could, explaining that his people valued hard work and honesty above all else. He told her that she would be welcomed because she had helped one of their own, but that she would need to prove herself useful if she wanted to stay permanently. "I can cook," Lucia offered, "and I can sew and mend clothes. I can clean and organize. In the houses where I worked, I did everything from scrubbing floors to preparing elaborate meals for dinner parties. I'm not afraid of hard work. That will serve you well," Halion said. "Our women work very hard. There is always food to prepare, hides to tan, clothes to make. And if you stay, you will need to learn other skills as well. How to identify edible plants, how to preserve meat, how to move quietly through the forest. These things keep you alive." As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, covered in juniper and pinon pine. The air grew slightly cooler, easier to breathe. They were getting closer to the mountains, to the hidden valleys where Halion's people made their home. He felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Soon they would be safe. Soon Nuna would be surrounded by family who would help care for her. That evening they made camp near a small spring that bubbled up from between two large rocks. The water was cold and clear, tasting of minerals and stone. They refilled the water skin and drank deeply, washing away the dust of the trail. Halion caught 2 rabbits in snares he had set while Lucia was nursing Nuna, and he cooked them over a small fire, sharing the meat with her. It was the first hot meal either of them had eaten in days, and they ate in grateful silence. After dinner, as the stars began to appear overhead, Lucia spoke again. "What will your people think of me?" she asked. "I'm not Apache. I am Mexican, and I know there is often tension between our peoples. Will they accept me?" Halion considered the question carefully before answering. "There will be questions," he admitted. "Some may be suspicious at first, but when they see what you have done for Nuna, when they understand that you saved her life, they will accept you. My mother especially will be grateful. She has been grieving for Ayana, and she feared she would lose Nuna as well. You have given her hope." Lucia nodded slowly, though worry still creased her forehead. "I will do my best," she said. "I will work hard and try to fit in. I do not want to cause any problems for you or your family." "You will not," Halion assured her. "You are saving my daughter's life. That is all that matters." They settled down to sleep, Lucia curled up near the fire with Nuna nestled against her chest, and Halion keeping watch as he had the night before. But this time, as he looked at the 2 of them sleeping peacefully in the firelight, he felt something he had not felt since Ayana died. Not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of hope. The first fragile shoots of healing, pushing up through burned ground. The desert wind whispered through the juniper trees, carrying with it the scent of sage and pine. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, its voice echoing off the rocks. And in the small circle of firelight, 3 souls who had been broken by loss began the slow, painful process of becoming whole again. Tomorrow they would continue their journey. Tomorrow they would face whatever challenges awaited them. But tonight, for the first time in what felt like forever, Halion allowed himself to believe that everything might actually be all right, that his daughter would survive. That this strange, sad woman who had appeared out of nowhere might become part of their family. That life somehow would go on. He looked up at the stars, at the vast sweep of the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light, and he whispered a prayer of thanks to Ayana's spirit. Wherever she was, whatever realm she now inhabited, he hoped she could see them. He hoped she knew that he had kept his promise. He hoped she approved of Lucia, this unexpected savior who had come when all hope seemed lost. The fire burned low, and Halion added more wood, watching the flames leap and dance. In the morning they would rise with the sun and continue north. In 2 more days they would reach the camp, and then a new chapter would begin, one none of them could have anticipated, but one that offered the possibility of healing and redemption for all of them. On the 3rd day of their journey, the mountain peaks rose before them like ancient sentinels guarding the sky. The air had grown noticeably cooler, scented with pine and cedar, a welcome change from the harsh desert heat they had left behind. Halion led them through a narrow canyon where the walls rose so high on either side that the sun only touched the ground for a few hours each day. The path was treacherous, strewn with loose rocks that could turn an ankle or cause a horse to stumble. But Halion navigated it with the confidence of someone who had walked this route countless times. Lucia had grown more comfortable on the horse over the past 3 days, though her body ached from the unfamiliar position and the constant swaying motion. Nuna remained strapped to her chest, and the baby had grown noticeably stronger with each feeding. Her skin had regained its healthy color, her eyes were brighter and more alert, and she had even begun to make small cooing sounds that filled Lucia's heart with an unexpected joy. Every time the baby looked up at her with those dark, curious eyes, Lucia felt the jagged edges of her grief soften just a little. They emerged from the canyon into a hidden valley that took Lucia's breath away. It was a place of stunning beauty, ringed by towering mountains on all sides, with a clear stream running through the center and meadows of tall grass rippling in the breeze. Scattered throughout the valley were small dwellings made of branches and animal hides, arranged in no particular pattern, but seeming to belong exactly where they stood. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and Lucia could see people moving about, tending to daily tasks. Children played near the stream, their laughter carrying across the distance. As they approached the nearest dwelling, people began to notice them. A woman straightened from where she had been scraping a deer hide, her hands stilling as she watched Halion walk into camp. A man sharpening a knife looked up, his expression shifting from concentration to surprise. Within moments, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of their tribesman returning with a stranger. An older woman pushed through the gathering crowd, moving faster than her age should have allowed. Her face was weathered like old leather, her long grey hair braided with strips of coloured cloth, but her eyes were sharp and penetrating. She stopped a few feet from Halion, her gaze moving from him to Lucia to the baby, and then back to him. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority. "My son," she said in Apache, and Lucia understood from her tone and Halion's reaction that this was his mother. "You have been gone many days. We feared the worst." Halion dismounted and approached his mother, his head bowed respectfully. "I am sorry I worried you, mother. But I have returned, and I have brought Nuna back alive." The old woman's eyes widened, and she moved quickly to Lucia's side, reaching up to pull back the blanket and see the baby's face. When she saw Nuna's healthy, sleeping countenance, tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. She spoke rapidly in Apache, words tumbling over each other, and Halion responded in the same language. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, while Lucia sat uncomfortably on the horse, aware that all eyes were on her. Finally, Halion switched to English, so Lucia could understand. "My mother asks how this miracle happened. I have told her that you saved Nuna's life, that you fed her when no one else would help us." The old woman looked up at Lucia with an expression that was difficult to read. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also curiosity and perhaps a hint of wariness. She spoke again, and Halion translated. "She says you are welcome in our camp. She says any woman who would save an Apache child when the world has turned against us is a woman of honor. She asks if you will dismount and allow her to embrace you as a daughter." Lucia's throat tightened with emotion. She carefully swung her leg over the horse and slid to the ground, her legs unsteady after 3 days of riding. Halion's mother stepped forward and pulled her into a fierce embrace, one hand cradling the back of Lucia's head, the other supporting Nuna between them. The old woman smelled of smoke and sage and something indefinable that reminded Lucia of her own grandmother, long dead. When they separated, the old woman spoke again, this time directly to the gathered crowd, Halion translated as his mother spoke. "This is Lucia Reyes. She has saved my granddaughter's life when the white man's towns turned my son away. She has traveled with him through the desert and asked for nothing in return. She will stay with us as long as she wishes, and any who show her disrespect will answer to me." There was a murmur of acknowledgement from the crowd. Some faces showed open welcome. Others remained neutral or skeptical, but no one voiced objection. Halion's mother gestured for them to follow her, and she led them to a dwelling on the far edge of the camp. It was larger than some of the others, well constructed with sturdy poles and carefully tanned hides that would keep out wind and rain. This was Ayana's home. Halion said quietly to Lucia, "My wife's. It has been empty since she died. My mother has been keeping it ready, hoping that Nuna and I would return. You will stay here with us. There is room enough for all of us." Inside, the dwelling was dim and cool, with sleeping pallets arranged along the walls and a fire pit in the center beneath a smoke hole. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the roof poles, and there were baskets stacked neatly in one corner. Everything was clean and orderly, maintained by a mother who refused to let go of hope. Halion's mother gestured for Lucia to sit on one of the pallets, and then she knelt before her, her hands reaching out to touch Nuna's face with infinite gentleness. She spoke in Apache, her voice thick with emotion, and Halion translated. She says Nuna looks like Ayana. She says she sees her daughter in the baby's eyes. She thanks you for giving her the chance to watch this child grow, to teach her the ways of our people, to see her become a woman. She says you have given an old woman a reason to keep living. Lucia felt tears prick her own eyes. Tell her, she said softly, that Nuna has given me a reason to keep living as well. That we have saved each other, Halion translated, and his mother nodded with understanding. She reached out and took Lucia's hand, squeezing it firmly, and the two women sat in silence for a moment, bound by the universal language of loss and love and the fierce determination to protect the innocent. Over the next several hours, Lucia was introduced to what felt like dozens of people. There were other women who came to see the baby and to assess this stranger in their midst. Most were kind, offering shy smiles and small gifts of food or useful items. A few were more reserved, watching Lucia with careful eyes that missed nothing. There were men who nodded respectfully from a distance but did not approach, following the customs that kept unrelated men and women from interacting too closely. And there were children, curious and bold, who stared at Lucia openly until their mothers shooed them away. Halion's mother, whose name Lucia learned was Desba, took charge of helping Lucia settle in. She showed her where water could be fetched from the stream, where food was stored communally so that no one went hungry even in lean times, where women gathered to work on various tasks throughout the day. She explained through Halion's translation that everyone in the camp contributed according to their abilities, and that Lucia would be expected to help once she had rested from her journey. "I want to help now," Lucia insisted. "I'm not injured or sick. I can work. Please, let me begin earning my place here." Desba studied her for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. She led Lucia to where several women were preparing a communal meal, and she introduced her to each one. The women were processing corn, grinding it between stones to make flour, and they made space for Lucia to join them. The work was hard on her hands and back, harder than scrubbing floors or washing dishes, but Lucia attacked it with determination. She watched how the other women moved, copied their technique, and pushed through the burning in her muscles. As she worked, the women around her began to talk, their voices low and musical. Lucia could not understand the words, but she caught the rhythm of their conversation, the occasional laugh, the comfortable silences between those who had known each other for years. One woman, younger than the others, with kind eyes and quick hands, tried to communicate with Lucia through gestures and expressions. She pointed to herself and said, "Kiona," and then pointed to Lucia with a questioning expression. "Lucia," she responded, and the woman repeated it carefully, her pronunciation slightly different but recognizable. Kiona smiled and nodded, then returned to her work. But throughout the afternoon, she would occasionally glance at Lucia and offer an encouraging smile, a small gesture that meant more than words. When Nuna began to fuss, signaling her need to feed, Lucia excused herself and moved away from the group to find a private spot. She settled beneath a large pine tree at the edge of the camp, arranging her shawl for modesty, and began to nurse the baby. The act had become natural now, almost instinctive. She no longer thought about the mechanics of it, but simply responded to Nuna's needs. As the baby drank, Lucia stroked her soft hair and hummed the same lullaby she used to sing to Rosalia. She did not hear Halion approach until he spoke. "My mother says you have made a good impression today. The women told her you work hard and do not complain. They say you learn quickly." Lucia looked up at him, surprised and pleased. "I want to belong here," she said simply. "I want to be useful. These people have accepted me when they had every reason not to. I will not take that for granted." Halion sat down on a nearby rock, his eyes distant as he looked out over the valley. "This is a good place," he said, "but it is not easy. The soldiers are always searching for us. The reservations they have created are prisons, and many of our people have been forced onto them. We stay hidden here, moving when we must, taking only what we need from the land. It is a life of constant vigilance, I understand," Lucia said. "And I am not afraid. I've already lost everything once. I know what it means to have nothing. Here at least I have purpose. I have Nuna, and I have your family's gratitude. That is more than I had 3 days ago when I was wandering in the desert with no destination. Halion nodded slowly. My mother wants you to know that you are not just a nurse for Nuna. She wants you to understand that if you stay, you will become part of our family. Not as a servant or a hired hand, but as one of us. That is how we survive. We are stronger together than we are apart. The weight of his words settled over Lucia like a blanket. Part of a family. She had not had that since her parents died when she was 16, leaving her to make her own way in a world that cared little for young Mexican girls with no money or connections. She had drifted from town to town, from job to job, always on the outside looking in. And then Rosalia had been born, and for 6 brief, shining months, Lucia had finally belonged to someone. She had been a mother, the most important role she had ever held. When the fever took her daughter, it had taken her identity as well, but now, holding Nuna, feeling the baby's warmth and weight, hearing the soft sounds of her feeding, Lucia felt that identity beginning to return. Not as Rosalia's mother, she could never be that again, but as something new, Nuna's protector, Nuna's lifeline. And perhaps, if she was very fortunate, something even more. I would like that very much, Lucia said quietly. To be part of your family, to have a place where I belong. I will do whatever is needed to earn that place. Halion stood and looked down at her, and for the first time since they had met, he smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and rusty from disuse, but it was genuine. You have already earned it, he said. Everything else is just living. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the camp gathered for the communal meal. Large pots of stew made from venison and wild vegetables were passed around, along with corn cakes and roasted roots. Lucia sat with Halion's family, Nuna sleeping peacefully in a cradleboard that Desba had produced from somewhere, beautifully crafted and decorated with beadwork. The old woman had tears in her eyes as she settled her granddaughter into it. Murmuring prayers in Apache, the meal was accompanied by conversation and laughter, stories being told and retold, children running between the adults and being gently corrected. Lucia could not understand most of what was said, but she did not feel excluded. People smiled at her, offered her choice pieces of meat, made sure her bowl was always full. She was being welcomed in the most fundamental way possible, through the sharing of food and fire and community. After the meal, as the stars began to appear overhead and the fires burned low, a man brought out a drum and began to play. The rhythm was hypnotic, steady as a heartbeat, and soon others joined in, some with rattles made from gourds, others simply clapping their hands. An elderly man began to sing, his voice high and wavering, but carrying a strange beauty that raised the hair on Lucia's arms. She did not understand the words, but she felt their power, the way they seemed to call to something ancient and primal deep inside her. Kiona, the young woman from earlier, came and sat beside Lucia. She gestured to the singers and spoke slowly, clearly trying to help Lucia understand. She pointed to the sky, then to the earth, then to her heart, and Lucia grasped that the songs were about the connection between all things, about the sacred relationship between the people and the land they lived on. As Lucia watched the faces around her, illuminated by firelight, she saw something she had never seen in any of the white towns where she had worked. She saw people who belonged to each other, who supported each other without question, who found joy in simple things like food and music and the company of their loved ones. There was hardship here, certainly. There was danger and uncertainty and the constant threat of discovery by soldiers who would force them onto reservations. But there was also something precious and increasingly rare in this rapidly changing world: true community. Later, as she lay on her pallet in Ayana's home, with Nuna sleeping beside her and Halion on the other side of the dwelling, Lucia stared up at the smoke hole and watched the stars slowly wheel overhead. She thought about the strange path that had led her here, about the loss and pain that had nearly destroyed her, about the moment she had seen Hellion's fire in the darkness and made the choice to approach rather than walk past. That single decision had changed everything. She reached out in the darkness and rested her hand gently on Nuna's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. This child was alive because Lucia had been willing to offer what she had. And Lucia was alive, truly alive, and not just surviving, because this child had needed her. It was a circle, a perfect exchange, the kind of miracle that happened when two broken people found each other at exactly the right moment. Outside, a night bird called, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of smoke and earth. And in the darkness of the dwelling, three people who had found each other against all odds rested together, taking the first fragile steps toward becoming a family. 3 weeks had passed since Lucia arrived at the camp, and she had fallen into a rhythm of daily life that felt almost natural. She rose each morning before dawn to help the other women prepare breakfast, ground corn, and gathered firewood, and spent her afternoons learning skills she had never needed in her life as a town maid. Kiona had taken it upon herself to become Lucia's teacher, showing her how to identify edible plants in the forest, how to tan hides properly so they would remain soft and supple, how to weave baskets from willow branches. The work was endless and exhausting, but Lucia threw herself into it with determination. Nuna had grown stronger with each passing day, her body filling out, her eyes bright and curious as she observed the world around her. She had begun to smile, a toothless grin that made Lucia's heart ache with joy every time she saw it. Desba doted on her granddaughter constantly, singing to her in Apache, carrying her around the camp to show her off to anyone who would look, teaching Lucia the traditional ways of caring for Apache babies. The old woman had even given Lucia a new dress, hand-sewn from soft deerskin and decorated with small shells around the collar. A gift that had brought tears to Lucia's eyes, but not everything in the camp was peaceful. Lucia had noticed tension growing among some of the men, heated discussions that would stop abruptly when she approached, worried glances exchanged when riders returned from scouting expeditions. She asked Helion about it one evening as they sat outside the dwelling watching the sunset, Nuna asleep in her cradleboard between them. "The soldiers are getting closer," Helion said quietly, his face grim. "They have been searching the mountains more aggressively in recent weeks. 2 days ago, our scouts spotted a patrol less than half a day's ride from here. They did not find us, but it is only a matter of time. The army is determined to force all Apache onto the reservations, and they will not stop until they succeed or until we are all dead." Lucia felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm evening air. "What will we do?" she asked. "Will we move the camp?" Helion shook his head. "Moving is dangerous. We would be exposed, vulnerable. The elders are meeting tonight to decide. Some want to stay and hope the soldiers move on. Others want to split into smaller groups and scatter through the mountains. There is no good choice, only different risks." That night, Lucia lay awake long after Helion's breathing had deepened into sleep, staring at the darkness and listening to every sound outside. The wind in the trees suddenly seemed threatening rather than peaceful. Every crack of a branch made her heart race. She thought about the soldiers she had seen in the towns, their casual cruelty, the way they spoke about Apache people as if they were animals to be hunted. She thought about what would happen if they found the camp, found Nuna. The fear was suffocating. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A young Apache man rode into camp at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat, his face tight with urgency. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and ran directly to where the elders were gathered. Within minutes, the entire camp was buzzing with alarm. Desba came to find Lucia, her face ashen beneath her weathered skin. "Soldiers," she said through Helion, who had appeared at his mother's side. "A large group, maybe 40 men. They are coming up the eastern canyon, the one we use to reach the lower valleys. They will be here by nightfall, maybe sooner. We must leave immediately. The camp erupted into organized chaos. People moved with practiced efficiency, taking down dwellings, packing supplies, gathering children. There was no panic, but the urgency was palpable. Lucia stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden change, until Kiona grabbed her arm and pulled her into motion. Together, they dismantled the dwelling Lucia shared with Halion and his mother, rolling up hides and bundling poles with swift, economical movements. "Take only what you can carry," Kiona said in halting Spanish she had been learning from Lucia. "Food, blankets, weapons, everything else we leave. We come back for it later, maybe. Or we not come back at all." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Lucia strapped Nuna securely to her chest in the cradleboard, making sure the baby was protected and warm. She gathered what supplies she could manage, her hands shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. Around her, the camp was disappearing with remarkable speed, as if the entire community was simply melting back into the forest that had hidden them for so long. Halion appeared at her side, a rifle in one hand and a pack slung over his shoulder. His face was set in hard lines, all traces of the gentle father she had come to know erased by the warrior he had to become. "Stay close to my mother," he said. "Do exactly what she tells you. The path we are taking is difficult, but it will hide our trail. Do not fall behind." They set out within the hour, moving in a long, strung-out line through the dense forest. The elders and warriors had decided to head deeper into the mountains, toward a series of caves that could shelter them if necessary. It was a brutal journey, climbing steep slopes covered in loose rock, pushing through thick underbrush that tore at their clothes and skin. Lucia's legs burned with effort, her lungs aching as she struggled to keep pace with Desba, who moved through the terrain with the sure-footedness of someone who had fled from soldiers many times before. Nuna began to cry from the jostling and the unfamiliar surroundings, her wails cutting through the quiet that everyone else was desperately trying to maintain. Lucia tried to soothe her, but the baby would not be comforted. Other people glanced back with worried expressions. A crying baby could give away their position to anyone tracking them. Desba stopped and turned, her face sympathetic but firm. "You must feed her," she said. "Now, make her quiet." There was no time for modesty or privacy. Lucia loosened the cradleboard straps and pulled Nuna out, fumbling with her dress while trying to keep moving forward. She managed to get the baby latched on while still walking, an awkward, painful process that made her stumble over roots and rocks. But Nuna quieted immediately, drinking hungrily, and the group was able to continue without the sound of her cries echoing through the forest. They traveled for hours without stopping, pushing themselves to the limit of endurance. The sun climbed high overhead and then began its descent toward the western peaks. Lucia's feet were bleeding inside her shoes, blisters forming and breaking and forming again. Her shoulders ached from carrying Nuna and her pack. Sweat soaked through her dress despite the cool mountain air. But she did not complain. She looked around at the others, at elderly people and small children making this same brutal journey, and she pushed herself to keep going. Just as the light was beginning to fade, they heard it. The distant sound of horses, the jangle of equipment, men's voices calling to each other. The soldiers had reached the camp. They were following the trail, and they were moving fast. The warriors immediately took defensive positions, spreading out along their back trail, preparing to delay the soldiers if necessary, while the rest of the group escaped. Halion pressed his rifle into his mother's hands and spoke rapidly in Apache. Desba's face went white, but she nodded and grabbed Lucia's arm, pulling her forward with renewed urgency. "Halion says we must run now," Desba panted, her English broken but understandable. "Warriors stay, fight if soldiers come close. We must get women and children to caves. Run, Lucia. Run fast." What had been a hard march became a desperate flight. People abandoned anything that slowed them down, leaving a trail of discarded possessions in their wake. Mothers carried toddlers, older children helping younger ones, the elderly pushed to the very edge of their capabilities. Lucia ran until her vision blurred, until every breath felt like knives in her lungs, until her legs moved on instinct alone because conscious thought had become impossible. Behind them, the sound of gunfire suddenly cracked through the mountain air. Short, sharp bursts that echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell how close the fighting was. Lucia stumbled and nearly fell, but Desba's iron grip on her arm kept her upright and moving. The old woman's face was streaked with tears, but her jaw was set with determination. They reached the caves just as full darkness fell. The entrance was a narrow cleft in the rock face, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. People squeezed through one by one, disappearing into the earth. When it was Lucia's turn, she had to turn sideways to fit through the gap, protecting Nuna's head with both hands as she scraped through the tight space. On the other side, the cave opened up into a larger chamber, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Someone lit a torch, and in its flickering light Lucia could see dozens of frightened faces. Children crying softly, women holding each other, old men sitting with their heads bowed. They had made it to safety, but at what cost? How many warriors had been left behind to face the soldiers? How many would never return? The questions hung in the air, unspoken but present in every worried glance. Desba sank down against the cave wall, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Lucia lowered herself beside the old woman, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Nuna had somehow fallen asleep despite everything, her small face peaceful in the torchlight. Lucia held her close and waited with the others, listening for sounds from outside, praying that Halion and the other warriors would come back safely. Hours passed in the darkness. No one spoke much. Some people slept fitfully, others sat awake and staring at nothing. Lucia dozed off at some point, her body simply shutting down from exhaustion, but she jerked awake at every small sound, her heart pounding. Beside her, Desba kept vigil with her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer. It was just before dawn when they heard footsteps approaching the cave entrance. Everyone tensed, the men who had stayed with the group reaching for whatever weapons they had. But then came the soft call, the agreed-upon signal that meant friend rather than foe. The warriors were returning. They filed in one by one, exhausted and dirty but alive. Lucia counted them frantically in the dim light, searching for Halion's familiar form. 1, 2, 5, 8, 10. Where was he? Had he been captured, killed? Her throat tightened with panic, and then he appeared, the last one through the entrance, limping slightly but whole. His shirt was torn and stained with what looked like blood, but he was moving under his own power. Relief flooded through Lucia so powerfully that she felt dizzy. Desba made a small sound, somewhere between a sob and a prayer, and reached out her hands toward her son. Halion made his way to them and collapsed heavily onto the ground. Up close, Lucia could see that the blood on his shirt was not his own, that he had cuts and bruises, but no serious wounds. He leaned his head back against the cave wall and closed his eyes for a long moment before speaking. "We delayed them," he said hoarsely. "Led them on a false trail deeper into the eastern canyons. They will be lost in there for at least a day, maybe 2, before they realize we doubled back. It gives us time to move again, to find a new place. But they know we are here now. They will keep searching." Desba handed him a water skin, and he drank deeply before continuing. "We cannot stay in these mountains anymore. Too many patrols, too much attention. Some of the elders are talking about surrendering, going to the reservation. They say it is better to live as prisoners than die free in these caves." Lucia heard the defeat in his voice, saw it in the slump of his shoulders. These were people who had been fighting for their freedom, their way of life, for decades. And they were losing, not because they were not brave or skilled, but because they were outnumbered and outgunned, because the world was changing in ways that left no room for them. She reached out and placed her hand on Halion's arm. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not just exhaustion or fear, but a deep, aching gratitude. She had stayed. When she could have run back to the white towns, back to safety, she had stayed with them. She had run with them, carried his daughter to safety, risked everything for people who were not her own. Except they were becoming her own. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, these people had stopped being strangers and started being family. Their struggle had become her struggle. Their survival had become bound up with her own. "We will figure it out," she said softly. "We will find a way. We have come too far to give up now." Hallian's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "You sound like Ayanna," he said. She never gave up either, even when things seemed impossible. It was the first time he had compared her to his wife, and Lucia understood the weight of the compliment. She was not replacing Ayanna, could never replace her, but she was becoming something in her own right. Someone who belonged here, someone who mattered. Around them the cave slowly came to life as dawn light began to filter through the entrance. People stirred, tended to injuries, shared what little food they had managed to bring. Children started to play quietly in the corners, their resilience a testament to how often they had lived through situations like this. And in the center of it all, 3 people sat together. A warrior exhausted from battle, an old woman who had seen too much loss, and a Mexican maid who had found her purpose in the most unlikely place. Outside, the sun rose over the mountains, indifferent to the human drama playing out below. Birds began to sing their morning songs. The wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, soldiers continued their search, determined to finish what they had started, to complete the destruction of a way of life that had existed for centuries. But in the cave, surrounded by people who had chosen to keep fighting, keep surviving, keep holding on to hope against all odds, Lucia made a silent vow. She would protect Nuna with everything she had. She would help these people however she could, and she would never, ever abandon them, no matter what dangers lay ahead, because this was what love looked like. Not the romantic kind from stories, but the fierce, protective love that bound families together. The love that said, "I will stand with you in the darkness. I will carry what you cannot carry. I will stay when everyone else has left." And as Nuna stirred against her chest and began to root for her morning feeding, Lucia felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a blessing. This was where she was meant to be. These were the people she was meant to love. And whatever came next, they would face it together. They remained in the caves for 5 days, living in semi-darkness, rationing food and water, sending scouts out only at night to check for soldier movements. The conditions were harsh, the air damp and cold, the space cramped with so many people pressed together. Children grew restless and cranky. The elderly suffered from the chill that seeped into their bones. And everyone's nerves were stretched to the breaking point by the constant tension of not knowing when or if they would be discovered. On the 6th morning, the scouts returned with news that sent ripples of whispered conversation through the cave. The soldiers had given up their search and returned to the fort, at least for now. But they had left behind a message, written in Spanish and English, and nailed to a tree at the abandoned campsite. One of the scouts had retrieved it, and now the elders gathered to discuss its contents while the rest of the camp waited anxiously. Hallian emerged from the meeting with his face carved from stone, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper. He found Lucia sitting near the cave entrance, where weak sunlight filtered through, nursing Nuna while Desba dozed fitfully beside them. He lowered himself to the ground with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. "They are offering terms," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The army commander says, if we turn ourselves in within 2 weeks, we will be allowed to go to the reservation peacefully. They promise food, shelter, safety. They say our children will be educated in American schools, that we will be taught farming and trades. They make it sound like a gift rather than a prison sentence." Lucia adjusted Nuna against her chest and looked at him carefully. "But you do not believe them." "I have seen the reservations," Hallian said bitterly. "I have spoken to people who escaped from them. The food they promise is rotten or never arrives. The shelter is crowded, Disease spreads quickly, and the schools they talk about, they take children away from their families and punish them for speaking their own language, for practicing their own customs. They do not want to help us. They want to erase us, to turn us into poor copies of white people who will never truly be accepted anywhere. He paused, his hands clenching into fists. But many of the elders are tired of running. They are old, and they remember when life was different, when we could move freely across these lands without fear. They want peace, even if the price is giving up everything that makes us who we are. And some of the younger families with small children, they are frightened. They do not want their babies growing up in caves, always hungry, always cold, always one step ahead of soldiers. Lucia felt Nuna's mouth go slack as the baby drifted off to sleep, satisfied and warm. She carefully adjusted her clothing and looked down at the peaceful little face. This child had no memory of her mother, would grow up knowing only what others told her about Ayana. And now her future hung in the balance, dependent on decisions made by exhausted, frightened people with no good options. "What do you want to do?" Lucia asked softly. "Not what the elders want, not what your mother wants. What does your heart tell you?" Halion was quiet for so long that Lucia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I want Nuna to grow up free," he said. "I want her to know the mountains and forests, to speak her mother's language, to understand the stories and songs of our people. I want her to be proud of who she is, not ashamed. But I also want her to be safe, to have enough food, to not have to run and hide every time she hears horses approaching. I want things I cannot have, and I do not know how to choose between them." Lucia reached out and placed her hand over his, feeling the rough calluses, the tension in his fingers. "There is another option," she said carefully. "One you have not mentioned." He looked at her with questioning eyes. "We could leave," Lucia said. "Not to the reservation. Somewhere else. Mexico, perhaps. I still speak Spanish fluently. We could cross the border, go to one of the remote villages in the mountains where no one asks too many questions. You could pass as Mexican with the right clothes, or we could say you are from one of the indigenous groups that live in the Sierra Madre. Nuna is young enough that she would adapt quickly. We could build a life there, away from American soldiers and reservation agents." She saw something flicker in Halion's eyes. Hope maybe, or the first stirring of possibility. But then it died, crushed under the weight of obligation. "I cannot abandon my people," he said. "My mother, the others who depend on me. What kind of man would I be if I saved myself and my daughter, but left everyone else to face this alone?" "Well, you would be a man who chose his child's future over his pride," Lucia said gently. "There is no shame in that. Your mother would understand. She would want Nuna to be safe, to have opportunities. That is what grandmothers want, always. The happiness and safety of their grandchildren above all else." Before Halion could respond, Desbar stirred and opened her eyes. She had been listening, Lucia realized. The old woman's face was unreadable as she sat up and looked at both of them. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm despite her exhaustion. She spoke in Apache, and Halion translated haltingly, his voice breaking on certain words. "My mother says she has lived a long life and seen many terrible things. She has watched our people driven from their homes, has seen friends and family killed by soldiers or disease or starvation. She says she's tired of watching children suffer for the mistakes and conflicts of adults. She says if there is a chance for Nuna to have a better life, even if it means leaving this land, then we should take it. She says a people can only truly die when they stop having children who remember them. As long as Nuna lives and knows her mother's name, knows the stories of her people, the Apache will continue." Tears streamed down Halion's face as he translated his mother's words. Desba reached out and cupped his cheek with her weathered hand, speaking more softly now, words meant only for him. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch like a child seeking comfort. "She says I have been a good son and a good father," Halion whispered. "She says Ayana would be proud of the man I have become, of the sacrifices I have made. She says it is time to stop sacrificing and start living. She gives us her blessing to go, to find safety for Nuna wherever we can. She says she will tell the others that we died in the mountains, so no one will look for us or think less of us for leaving. Desba pulled Halion into an embrace, and the big warrior who had fought soldiers and survived impossible odds broke down completely in his mother's arms. He sobbed like a child, all the grief and fear and exhaustion of the past months pouring out of him in great, wrenching waves. Lucia felt her own tears falling as she watched, understanding the enormity of what was being decided. They would leave behind everything familiar, everyone they knew, and venture into an uncertain future with nothing but each other and hope. When Halion finally pulled away from his mother, he wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at Lucia with red-rimmed eyes. "If we do this," he said, "if we leave, it must be soon, before the elders make their decision about the reservation. And we must go quietly in the night, so no one tries to stop us or asks to come with us. We can only take what we can carry on one horse. Everything else stays behind." Lucia nodded. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Halion said, "while the others sleep. My mother will create a distraction in the morning when they discover we are gone. We'll tell them we went scouting and never returned. By the time anyone realizes what really happened, we will be too far away to follow." The rest of that day passed in a blur of secret preparations. Desba gathered supplies for them, things that could be easily explained if anyone noticed: small packages of dried meat and corn, a water skin, a warm blanket. Lucia fed Nuna as much as the baby would take, knowing it might be hours before she could feed her again. She memorized the faces of the people she had come to care about over the past weeks. Kiona with her kind smile, the children who had grown comfortable enough to play near her, the elderly women who had taught her their skills without judgment. As evening fell and people settled in for another night in the cave, Lucia lay down with Nuna as if preparing to sleep like everyone else. But her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Beside her, Desba sat with her back against the cave wall, keeping watch, ready to alert them if anyone stirred. Halion was somewhere near the cave entrance, supposedly on guard duty, but actually preparing their escape route. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Lucia kept her eyes closed, but every muscle in her body was tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. Nuna slept peacefully, unaware that her life was about to change forever. Around them, the cave was filled with the sounds of sleep, snoring and shifting bodies, the occasional whimper of a dreaming child. Finally, just after midnight when the darkness was deepest, Halion touched Lucia's shoulder gently. It was time. She sat up carefully, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid making noise. Desba helped her secure Nuna in the cradle board, making sure every strap was tight, every blanket tucked properly. The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she worked, but her face was composed. When everything was ready, Desba pulled Lucia into a tight embrace. She whispered something in Spanish, words Lucia barely caught. "Cuida a mi nieta. Cuida a mi hijo. Take care of my granddaughter. Take care of my son." Lucia nodded against the old woman's shoulder, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then Desba turned to Halion and embraced him one last time. They stood together for a long moment, mother and son, saying goodbye in the only way that mattered, through touch and presence. When they finally separated, Desba's face was wet with tears, but she gestured firmly toward the cave entrance. Go now before I change my mind and beg you to stay." They crept through the sleeping camp like ghosts, stepping carefully over outstretched legs and scattered belongings. At the entrance, Halion paused and looked back one last time at the cave that sheltered his people, at the community that had been his entire world. Lucia saw his jaw clench, saw him wrestling with the decision even now. But then Nuna made a small sound in her sleep, and his face hardened with resolve. He turned away and led them out into the night. His horse was waiting where he had hidden it earlier, already saddled and ready. Halion lifted Lucia onto its back first, then handed Nuna up to her before mounting behind them. With Lucia and the baby secured between his arms and the saddle, He guided the horse away from the cave, moving slowly at first to minimize sound, then faster once they were far enough away that the hoofbeats would not carry back to wake anyone. They rode through the darkness with only starlight to guide them, following paths that Halion knew by instinct and memory. The horse picked its way carefully down the mountainside, through forests and across streams, always heading south toward the distant border. Lucia held Nuna close and tried not to think about what they were leaving behind, tried to focus instead on what lay ahead. A new life, a new chance, safety for this precious child who had brought them together. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, they stopped at a high overlook to rest the horse and check their bearings. From this vantage point they could see for miles in every direction, the mountains stretching endlessly before them, beautiful and terrible in their immensity. Somewhere behind them, Desba would be waking to find them gone, would be preparing to deliver the lie that would protect them. Somewhere ahead, an unknown future waited. Halion dismounted and helped Lucia down, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. They stood together watching the sunrise, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Lucia spoke. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Halion looked down at Nuna, still sleeping peacefully in her cradleboard, blissfully unaware of everything that had been sacrificed for her. "I think we made the only choice we could live with," he said. "Whether it is right or wrong, only time will tell. But I know this. I would rather die trying to give her a chance at happiness than watch her grow up in a prison pretending to be a sanctuary." Lucia reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It was the first time she had initiated such contact, and she felt him startle slightly before his hand tightened around hers. "Then we will face whatever comes together," she said. "The three of us. A family. Perhaps not in the traditional way, but a family nonetheless." Halion turned to look at her fully, and in the early morning light she saw something shift in his expression. The walls he had kept up, the distance he had maintained out of respect for his dead wife's memory, began to crack. "Lucia," he said softly, "you have become more to me than just Nuna's nurse. You have become more than just a friend or a companion. I do not know when it happened or how, but somewhere along this journey you became essential to me, and I need you to know that before we cross that border and start our new life—" Lucia felt her breath catch in her throat. She had not allowed herself to acknowledge her own growing feelings, had told herself she was here only for Nuna, only to fulfill a purpose. But standing here in the dawn light with this man who had shown her what it meant to love selflessly, to sacrifice everything for those you cared about, she could no longer deny the truth. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I tried not to, out of respect for Ayana's memory. But you have shown me that my heart is not dead, that I can still feel joy and hope and, yes, love. Not the desperate, grief-stricken love I felt when I was wandering the desert ready to give up, but something deeper, something that has grown slowly from shared struggles and quiet moments and the simple act of choosing each other every day." Halion cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms rough but gentle against her skin. "Ayana would have liked you," he said. "She would have been grateful that you saved our daughter, and I think she would have understood this, what is growing between us. She never wanted me to be alone, to raise Nuna without a partner. She made me promise before she died that I would find happiness again if I could. I thought that was impossible, but then you appeared out of the darkness and showed me otherwise." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Lucia did not pull away. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence. It was not the passionate kiss of new lovers, but something quieter, deeper. A promise, a commitment, a recognition that what they had built together over these past weeks was real and worth fighting for. When they finally pulled apart, The sun had fully risen, flooding the world with golden light. Nuna chose that moment to wake up, her eyes opening wide, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise, as if she understood the significance of what had just happened. Lucia laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and lifted the baby from her cradleboard. To hold her between them? Well then, Halion said with a smile that transformed his entire face, made him look younger and less burdened. I suppose we should continue our journey. We have a long way to go before we reach the border, and an even longer way to go before we truly find home. But for the first time in a very long time, I believe we actually will find it. They mounted the horse again, this time with a new sense of unity, a new understanding of what they meant to each other. As they rode down the far side of the mountain toward the distant border, toward an uncertain future in a foreign land, they carried with them hope and determination and love. 3 people who had been broken by loss, now choosing to build something new together. Not perfect, not easy, but real and worth every sacrifice. The journey to the Mexican border took 12 days of hard travel through terrain that seemed determined to break them. They rode through scorching desert valleys where the heat made the air shimmer like water, climbed over rocky passes where one misstep could send them tumbling hundreds of feet, and forded rivers swollen with mountain snowmelt that threatened to sweep them away. They slept under the stars when the weather permitted and huddled under rock overhangs when storms rolled through. Their supplies dwindled dangerously low, forcing Halion to hunt with makeshift snares and forage for edible plants, while Lucia rationed what little they had left. Nuna thrived despite the hardships, growing rounder and more alert with each passing day. Her eyes had begun to track movement, her hands reaching out to grab at anything within range, her voice experimenting with new sounds that were not quite words, but held the promise of language emerging. Lucia fed her whenever needed, no longer concerned about privacy or propriety when survival was the priority. The baby had become the center of their small universe, the reason they pushed through exhaustion and fear, the symbol of everything they were fighting to protect. On the 13th day, as the sun climbed toward noon and the heat became almost unbearable, they crested a low ridge and saw it. The Rio Grande, flowing broad and muddy through the landscape, and on the far side, Mexico, freedom, safety, a chance to start over. Halion reined in the horse, and they sat for a long moment, just staring at the river that represented the boundary, between their hunted past and their hopeful future. No, once we cross, Halion said quietly, there is no going back. We become different people. I will no longer be Halion of the Chiricahua Apache. You will no longer be Lucia Reyes from wherever you came from. We will have to invent ourselves anew, create a story that explains who we are and why we are together. Lucia shifted Nuna in her arms and looked at the man beside her, this warrior who had been willing to give up everything for his daughter's sake, who had opened his heart again despite the pain of loss. Then let us decide now who we will become, she said. Let us choose names and a history that we can live with, that feels true even if the details are invented. They spent the next hour planning their new identities as they made their way down to the riverbank. Halion would become Alejandro Cortez, taking Lucia's surname as his own, claiming to be from a small Apache band in Sonora that had lived peacefully alongside Mexican settlements for generations. Lucia would remain herself, but they would say they had married 2 years ago, that Nuna was their daughter born of their union. It was a simple story, plausible enough not to raise immediate suspicions in the remote mountain villages where they planned to settle. The river crossing was treacherous. The water ran deeper and faster than it had appeared from the ridge, and the horse struggled against the current, its eyes rolling with fear. Halion guided the animal with firm hands and soothing words, while Lucia held Nuna high above the water, her heart in her throat as muddy waves splashed against the horse's flanks. For several terrifying moments, it seemed the current would win, would drag them downstream and dash them against the rocks visible jutting from the water. But the horse found its footing on the far bank and lunged forward, scrambling up the muddy slope until they stood dripping but safe on Mexican soil. They rested for an hour, letting their clothes dry in the fierce sun and allowing the horse to recover from its exertion. Nune fussed at the unfamiliar surroundings, and Lucia nursed her while Hallian scouted ahead, looking for signs of any settlements or roads. When he returned, his face showed cautious optimism. "There is a village about 3 hours' ride to the west," he said. "I can see smoke from cooking fires, hear church bells. It looks small, quiet, a good place to start. We should arrive before dark if we leave now." The village of San Miguel de las Montañas clung to the mountainside like a collection of whitewashed boxes scattered by a careless hand. Adobe houses with red tile roofs lined narrow, winding streets paved with cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of use. A small church dominated the central plaza, its bell tower visible from miles away, and around it clustered a mercantile, a cantina, a blacksmith shop, and various other establishments necessary for a community living in relative isolation from larger towns. They entered the village in late afternoon, when shadows were beginning to lengthen and people were emerging from their houses after the hottest part of the day. Curious faces watched them pass, taking in the travel-worn couple on a tired horse with a baby strapped to the woman's chest. Olean guided them directly to the church, understanding that in places like this, the priest was often the key to acceptance or rejection by the community. Father Tomas was a round man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands perpetually stained with ink from the letters he wrote on behalf of illiterate parishioners. He welcomed them into the cool interior of the church and listened with patient attention as they told their carefully rehearsed story. Alejandro Cortés and his wife Lucia, traveling south to escape troubles with American authorities, looking for a place to settle and raise their daughter in peace. They had some skills to offer. He could work with leather and wood. She could cook and clean and sew. They were not asking for charity, only a chance to prove themselves worthy of the community's trust. Father Tomas studied them both carefully, his gaze lingering on Nuna with the peculiar intensity of someone who understood more than what was being said. Finally, he nodded slowly. "There is a small house at the edge of the village," he said. "It belonged to old Senora Martinez, who passed last winter. Her children have moved to the city and do not want it. You may stay there in exchange for maintaining the property and paying a small rent once you have established yourselves. The house needs work, but it has a roof and walls and a place to cook. It's better than sleeping under the stars." Lucia felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Father," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We will work hard. We will be good members of this community. You will not regret helping us." The priest smiled and made the sign of the cross over them. "I believe God brought you here for a reason," he said. "And I believe this little one," he gestured to Nuna, "carries a special blessing. She has the look of someone who has been saved from great darkness. Honor that salvation by living well, by raising her with love and wisdom, and by contributing to the life of this village. That is all I ask." The house Father Tomas showed them was indeed in need of work. The roof had gaps where tiles had fallen, the walls needed fresh whitewash, and the interior was filled with the possessions Senora Martinez's children had not bothered to take with them, old furniture and cooking pots and religious icons covered in dust. But to Lucia and Hallian, it looked like paradise. 4 walls, a real floor, a fireplace for cooking, windows that could be shuttered against storms. After weeks of caves and sleeping on the ground, it was a palace. They spent the remaining daylight hours sweeping and cleaning, making one room habitable enough to sleep in. Neighbors began to appear at the door as word spread of the newcomers, bringing small gifts of welcome. A woman named Rosa brought fresh tortillas and beans. An old man named Felipe offered the loan of tools for repairs. A young couple with children close to Nuna's age brought a wooden cradle they had outgrown. Each gift was received with overwhelming gratitude, each act of kindness another thread weaving them into the fabric of this community. That night, as they lay on borrowed blankets in their new home, with Nuna sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside them, Lucia and Halion talked quietly about the future they would build. He would advertise his skills and hopefully find work, making saddles and tack for the ranchers in the surrounding hills. She would take in washing and mending, perhaps eventually offer her services as a cook for special occasions. Together, they would save money, improve the house, create a stable home for Nuna. It would not be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their lives that felt almost normal. Halion quickly gained a reputation as a skilled craftsman, and soon he had more work than he could handle. Lucia became known for her excellent cooking and her willingness to help anyone who needed it. Whether that meant caring for sick children while their mothers worked, or teaching young women how to make the elaborate dishes she had learned in the wealthy households where she had been employed. Nuna continued to grow and thrive, her laughter becoming a familiar sound in the village, her bright eyes and ready smile winning hearts wherever she went. But adjustment was not without its challenges. Halion struggled with being confined to one place after a lifetime of movement and freedom. Sometimes Lucia would wake in the night to find him standing at the window, staring out at the mountains, his face etched with longing for something he could never return to. She would go to him and place her hand on his back, offering wordless comfort, and he would turn and pull her close, burying his face in her hair until the moment passed. Lucia had her own struggles. Her milk had finally begun to dry up as Nuna started eating solid foods, and the process was both physically painful and emotionally wrenching. It marked the end of the unique bond she had shared with the baby, the thing that had made her essential and irreplaceable. She grieved it in private, tears falling as she prepared meals or scrubbed clothes, mourning the loss even as she understood it was natural and necessary. One evening, 6 months after their arrival in San Miguel, Halion found her crying quietly in the garden behind their house where she had been hanging laundry. He sat beside her and waited patiently for her to compose herself enough to speak. "I fed her for the last time today," Lucia said, her voice breaking. "She does not need me anymore, not in that way. And I know it is right. I know she is growing as she should. But it feels like I am losing her, losing the one thing that made me her mother, instead of just the woman who cares for her." Halion took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "You are her mother in every way that matters," he said firmly. "Not because of milk, but because of love. Because you show up every day and meet her needs even when you are exhausted. Because you comfort her when she cries and celebrate when she learns something new. Because when she looks at you, she sees safety and love and home. That is what makes a mother, not biology or milk or any of those other things. Just love and presence and commitment. And you have given her all of that and more." Lucia leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When did you become so wise?" she asked with a watery smile. "When I met a woman brave enough to walk out of the darkness and save my daughter's life," he replied. "When I watched that same woman leave behind everything familiar to come with us into the unknown. When I realized that family is not about blood, but about who shows up, who stays, who chooses you every single day. You taught me that, Lucia. You and your incredible, stubborn, beautiful heart." She turned to face him fully, her hands coming up to cup his face. "I love you," she said, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything they had been through together. "I love you, and I love Nuna, and I love the life we are building here. And I am grateful every single day that I saw your fire that night in the desert, that I made the choice to approach instead of walking past. That one decision changed everything." "I love you too," Halion said, and then he kissed her, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, he smiled at her with an expression of pure joy. "I think it is time we made this official," he said. "Let us ask Father Tomas to marry us, truly marry us." not as a fiction for the village, but as a real commitment before God and these people who have become our community. What do you say?" "Yes," Lucia said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 1 month later in the small church with the entire village in attendance. Lucia wore a simple white dress that the women of San Miguel had sewn for her as a gift, and Halian wore new clothes that made him look less like a warrior and more like a prosperous craftsman. Nuna, now 10 months old and able to sit up on her own, gurgled happily throughout the ceremony from the arms of Rosa, who had become like an aunt to her. When Father Tomas pronounced them husband and wife, and they kissed for the first time as a married couple, the congregation erupted in applause and joyful shouts. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. With food and music and dancing in the plaza, old Felipe played his guitar while others sang traditional songs. Children ran wild with excitement and too much sugar. And in the center of it all, Halian and Lucia danced together, their movements unpracticed, but their joy undeniable. They had traveled so far, suffered so much, lost and found and lost again. But they had also discovered something rare and precious, a love born not from passion or convenience, but from shared struggle and the daily choice to build something beautiful from broken pieces. 5 years passed. Nuna grew from a baby into a bright, curious child who spoke both Spanish and the Apache words her father taught her in private, who helped her mother in the kitchen and learned leatherworking at her father's side, who was loved by the entire village as if she belonged to everyone. 2 more children joined their family, a son named Miguel and a daughter named Ana, both born in the little house that Halian and Lucia had transformed from a ruin into a true home. On Nuna's 6th birthday, as the family gathered for a simple celebration with cake and songs, Halian took his oldest daughter aside and presented her with a gift. It was a small leather pouch containing a lock of black hair and a piece of red and black woven fabric, the only items he had kept from his old life. "This hair belonged to your first mother," he told Nuna gently, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Her name was Ayana, and she was the bravest, strongest woman I ever knew. She loved you so much that she gave her life so you could live. And this fabric is from a blanket she made for you before you were born. I want you to have these things so you will always remember where you came from, who you are." Nuna held the pouch carefully, her young face serious as she processed this information. "But Mama Lucia is my mother too," she said, a question in her voice. "Yes," Halian said firmly. "You were blessed with 2 mothers, one who gave you life and one who saved it and raised you with more love than any child could hope for. Both of them are part of you, and both of them will always be with you. That is a gift, Mia. Not all children are so fortunate." Nuna thought about this for a moment, then nodded and tucked the pouch into her pocket. "I am lucky," she said simply. "I have the best family in the whole world." That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Lucia and Halian sat outside under the stars, holding hands and watching the moon rise over the mountains. From inside came the soft sounds of their children breathing, 3 lives they were responsible for protecting and nurturing and guiding toward adulthood. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucia asked softly. "Leaving your people, your mother, everything you knew. Do you ever wish you had made a different choice?" Halian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I grieve what was lost," he finally said. "I grieve for my mother and the others I left behind, wonder what became of them. I grieve for the culture and traditions that are being erased, for the way of life that is disappearing. That grief will always be part of me. But regret? No, I do not regret choosing to give Nuna a chance at safety and happiness. I do not regret finding you and building this life with you. I do not regret our children or this community or this home we have made. I carry both things inside me, grief and gratitude, and I have learned they can exist together." Lucia squeezed his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to think my life ended when Rosalia died," she said. "I thought I would never be happy again, never have purpose or meaning. I was wandering in the darkness, literally and figuratively, waiting for permission to give up. And then I saw your fire. Such a small thing, such an ordinary thing, but it changed everything. It gave me back my life and gave me a family I never dreamed I could have. We saved each other, Hallian said simply. That is what people do when they love each other. They show up in the darkness with whatever they have to offer, even if it seems small or insufficient. They share their fire, their milk, their hope, and somehow, impossibly, it is enough. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, listening to the night sounds of the village settling into sleep around them. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a baby cried briefly before being soothed. Somewhere life continued in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. And in that moment, in that place, everything was exactly as it should be. Not perfect, because life never is. Not without sorrow or challenge, or the lingering ache of things lost. But good, real, worth every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt and fear. They had walked through fire and darkness and emerged on the other side, not unscathed but stronger, not unchanged but better for the changing. Their story was not one that would be told in history books or sung in ballads. It was quieter than that, more personal. Just two broken people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose each other and kept choosing each other every day after, who built a family from grief and hope and stubborn determination, who proved that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about passion or destiny, but about showing up, staying present, and doing the hard work of building a life together one day at a time. And somewhere in the mountains far to the north, in a cave or on a reservation, or perhaps only in memory and spirit, an old Apache woman named Desba looked up at the same stars and smiled. Her granddaughter was safe. Her son had found peace. The circle was complete, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.